Hello, and a very good morning to you, beautiful infinite beings, right onto your path of exploring the infinite, your infinite potential, your infinite truth, and ultimately your infinite self. Thank you for tuning in today's video, in which I'm going to be speaking about trauma. You say everything. You curse that person, you curse the event, you go as harsh as possible. Get everything out of your system in your imagination and make it as lucid as possible, because what essentially you want to do here is that you want to fool your ego into thinking that it was not really an unsafe experience. It was not really that traumatizing, because you've these are all the things you could have done, but what we're doing is that you're telling it that I'm doing it, and depending on the depth it's been buried to and the duration it's been there for. More specifically, I'm going to be discussing briefly the concept or the nature of trauma, in which I'll then be moving on to mentioning a very powerful technique in which you can practice in any time or any setting, and that is very powerful, that would very significantly aid in healing your traumas. And if you stick around towards the end, I'm going to be mentioning two bonus techniques that will significantly aid in healing your traumas, one of which has actually been proven to be more efficient, more effective in treatment of PTSD patients more than any administered medical drug. So stick around if you'd like to grasp on the whole thing. So before anything, we need to understand that a traumatic experience is a very, very subjective matter. What I mean by that is what is traumatizing to you could mean nothing to someone else. What could be very extremely traumatizing to someone could be second nature to someone else. For example, if someone is used to falling in and out of intimate, deep relationships, someone who's used to moving between partners, used to losing someone dear to them, and would find someone else and would be very happily would be very happy to indulge and to move on very easily, would not be traumatized, for example, by a breakup. However, someone else could be extremely agonized by something such as a breakup from an intimate relationship, and it could be recorded in their body and their brains as a traumatizing experience. The same thing goes with money, for example. Someone who's into business and deals with huge amounts of money, in which they could gain a lot at once and lose a lot at once, would feel nothing towards losing a huge investment, for example. Would just be barely agonized for a few hours or a day and then move on, while to someone else it could be again an extremely traumatizing experience that's going to leave a deep wound on their inner self for times to come, if not addressed and healed in a proper manner. And however, the reason it is such, for example, if someone gotten used to something, or what in which it used to be a trauma to them, because the first encounter is going to be traumatizing no matter what, they either find a coping mechanism, they either develop a coping mechanism in which later encounters, later occurrence of such traumatizing experiences would be numbed by them rather than not be existent. So they would, for example, they would indulge in other pleasures, or in stimulants to get over the pain of such a traumatizing experience. And so every time this happens, they could be well adapted and they know they fall right into their coping mechanism, and they feel nothing through the experience itself, which is the crisis, and then it pents up, and then it builds up and records in the body as a trauma. However, by doing so, they desensitize themselves to traumas, to this specific traumatizing experience, and on the long run it becomes traumas in general, in which they become numb to whatever happens around them, and that is not a very healthy way to deal with it. Although they might not be deeply triggered every time a trauma, they recall the experience, or they are reminded by a similar experience, they might not be very triggered, and they might not go into survival mode, because they know it's recorded in their memory and their muscles and in their essence that they can deal with it, that they have a way of coping with such an occurrence. So it's not like a fight or flight kind of scenario, and they do not go into survival mode. They're well adept in a sense. However, if you're someone who does this, you'll notice on the long run that the more you build up of these things, the more you bury that deep down and desensitize yourself to such experiences and numb the pain by indulging in pleasures and stimulants, that on the long run, the more of it you store in your system, the more you're gonna become unmotivated to live. Basically, on the long run, you're gonna be unwilling to pursue your dreams and demotivated basically to follow your passions and your to hobbies, and to go by living a life that you want for yourself, because what you will record in your energy and in your essence, and of course in your brain cells and in your even body cells, is that you're not able to, that you've adapted to failure, and that every time, the more you build of these experiences, the more you're gonna, in other words, accept the nature of trauma, that you're gonna accept traumas, and so you will not feel like you're motivated to pursue anything that might cause a trauma. And in a sense, that's a very retarding trait for someone to have, because it's gonna keep them from reaching any of their potential, of pursuing any of what they could be. However, another way of becoming less and less affected by a traumatic experience is when you address the first time it happens, you go through the pain of it, through the pain of the crisis. See, the difference between a trauma is usually something in the past. When I talk about trauma, I mean something that's been stored within you in the past, and it's traumatizing in a sense. I'm gonna go into why that is in a moment, but for now, it's something that's traumatizing. However, when you're going through it, when you're, for example, presently experiencing something that might end up being a trauma, then you're probably going through what is called a crisis. So if every time you go through a crisis, you let the pain settle in, and then you sit down and you try to heal it, try to approach it in the right way, and try to understand and make sense of everything, because that's basically what trauma is that your brain could not comprehend, could not find meaning, and it felt completely unsafe to go through that experience, and while being helpless, and while having no salvation whatsoever. And so it becomes recorded as a trauma for later reference. However, if you address it right after, and you do not let it get buried deep down and try to escape it and cope with it through any mechanism, what you're doing is that you're adapting yourself to the process of smartly maneuvering your way around such occurrence. And the more you experience of it, the more it becomes less and less traumatizing, the more it becomes less of a crisis. For example, I mentioned, and it really depends, and you even change your perspective. Your perspective towards this traumatizing experience becomes different. I spoke a lot about this. For example, in my previous video about crisis, how to get over a crisis, how to heal from the pain, the consequences of an occurrence such as a crisis, and in another one, which is how darkness could be a very beneficial tool, how it could be utilized to your own benefit, and how it could be one of the best teachers. I speak even of how something that would perhaps end up being a trauma could be a manifestation of yourself, because you want the lesson, you've manifested the lesson that could only be learned by you through such an experience. And so if you're interested, you might feel free to go and watch either of them. And while I'm on it, if you enjoy watching my content, please hit the subscribe button and like whatever videos you enjoy watching. Anyway, the more you experience those events and healthily approach them and address the subject that matters here, you become more and more tolerant of a traumatic experience. And it doesn't have to be in the same exact thing that you become tolerant to. No, you generally become tolerant because now you understand what it's all about, and you understand that you come out the other side just fine, and you understand that you can take care of yourself, and you understand what you need to do and what's the process. So it becomes, over time, it becomes less and less traumatizing. And so even to yourself, trauma is subjective. The first time you experience a traumatic event is not the same as the second time, and I mentioned this even in my video. And even if the first time could be something that's generally could be looked as a not very severe traumatic experience, but it hits you very hard, that leaves you with a built-up trauma that you're, every time you remember it, or you're reminded with a similar thing, you become traumatized. You live in fear, and you just cower in fear and go into survival mode, and quit life for some time before you come back again. And however, the second time it could be something much more extremely traumatizing, yet from a general sense, yet you react much better to it. You do not crumble through the crisis, you do not completely shut down and go into survival mode, and you rather go into speculation and observation and wait on the pain and understand it while it's happening, so it doesn't end up being recorded as a trauma. And that's why it's a very highly subjective matter. And the next thing we need to understand is that the ego plays a very big part when it comes to trauma. And that is evident by, for example, a traumatic experience. Let's say you envision your trauma and you feel in a certain way, however horrible that is. Now imagine you're going through an elevated state of mind, for example using stimulants like alcohol or drugs, or for example, even better, being in a deep meditative state. And now bring out this traumatic experience. It's not gonna feel the same way of horrible. It's not gonna feel as horrible as when you're just living, like recalling it normally in a very normal beta brainwave state, basically. And the reason is because in a deep meditative state, or in a very highly elevated state of mind in general, you're disconnecting from your ego. You're not anymore just your ego. You're not surrendering to your egoistic needs. You're not being defined, or you do not just identify with your ego at that point. You feel more of a connection towards the world. You feel a connection towards higher things. You feel a connection towards many more other things. And so when the ego is not very active, the effect of a trauma, the experience of recalling a trauma, feels different, feels much less severe. And that's when you know that the ego plays a huge role in how you feel towards a trauma, because what a trauma basically is that, and something that's happened at some point in which your ego could not bear the weight of it, and with no salvation whatsoever, and with having no way of making a meaning out of it, of understanding why it has to happen this way, or why it has to happen to you, or what it even is that made you feel so horrible. It ends up just burying it as deep as possible to be able to go on living, and that's what survival mode, because if you have no healthy outlet for it, it has to go somewhere away from the ego's direction, away from the ego's focus, in order for the ego to continue living, and that's survival mode for the ego. And so what you need to do in order to, now let's imagine it's already been recorded, you've already been traumatized, and you haven't processed it in a healthy way at that time, and it's been deeply buried as a trauma that every time it comes up, every time you're reminded with similar thing, you become very triggered. What you need to do is that you have to bring it up, you have to bring it all the way up, you have to recall it, you have to relive every single moment. Just, and you've probably heard this a lot, but it's, you have to recall every single moment and relive it as if you were there. And I know it's gonna feel horrible, it's gonna be horrendous, you're gonna feel very triggered and very frustrated and very weak and very helpless, but those are all the feelings that you should feel, that you should have felt, if the ego did not try to make sense out of it by any sort of coping mechanism at the time. And so when all of these feelings, when you start feeling these feelings and you recall, you have the whole scenario in visualization, in imagination, you really imagine it, you really go deep into every little detail, you know, the difficult conversations around it, what followed, what was before that, what came next, everything. You envision the whole thing, you imagine the whole thing. And now what you do now is you make it your own scenario, you make it, you say the things you want, you say all of the things you wanted to say, you become as harsh as you want it to be, you become, you blame as much as you want any other partner included in this traumatizing experience, you shout, and you, now you could do this real time. However, if it's something in the past, probably you don't have access to it, or for whatever reason, if you do not feel comfortable of doing it real time, if you do not have access to, if you're scared of doing it real time, if for any reason you cannot do it live in real time, then by all means, it does not have to be so. And so you imagine it, and you do everything that you wanted to do in your imagination as lucid as possible, as imaginative as possible, and you say everything. You know, it's just like penting up when you have lots inside you buried that you wanna say, and you just say it out loud, or you bring it out in the form of a burst, a scream or something, and you feel slightly better after. It's the same concept in a sense. And so when you address the whole thing, and when you say everything that you wanted to say, when you prove yourself right in this imagination, and when you know, you say everything, you curse that person, you curse the event, you go as harsh as possible, get everything out of your system in your imagination, and make it as lucid as possible. Because what essentially you want to do here is that you want to fool your ego into thinking that it was not really an unsafe experience, it was not really that traumatizing, because these are all the things you could have done. But what we're doing is that you're telling it that I'm doing it, and depending on the depth it's been buried to, and the the duration it's been there for. It could be, you could might have to do this once or twice or 3 times, but it shouldn't take more than that. It happens very fast, and you will directly feel much better right after you do it, even just for once. And this it brings to mind, there's this psychiatrist and a neuroscientist, a trauma expert, Bessel, Bessel van der Kolk, I believe was his name, and he's a trauma expert. And there's this technique they came out with through experimentation, he and his colleagues or his team, and it's called something eye movement. Yeah, it's EMDR, I guess. Yeah, EMDR. It's eye movement desensitization and reprocessing, I believe. I'm not sure if they're reprocessing, but I think it's reprocessing. Eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. And basically the technique is that they make the patient the victim of a traumatic experience to recall all of the whole experience in all of its details, as lucid as possible, as vivid as possible. And what they do is that they swing a pendulum, or they just move a finger in front of their open eyes, and while the client is recalling this whole experience, the eye is pulling them into a hypnotic state, more of a meditative state. What it does to the body is that it trains the body to know that it's a rather safe experience, that I'm recalling all of this horrible experience, yet now I'm safe. Now it doesn't have to be unsafe, it doesn't have to be this horrible. And that is how you trick the ego basically into knowing that it's not necessarily unsafe, it's not necessarily an unsafe experience. And now here's where some might say that it's basically essentially just denial. It's you're fooling your ego, you're fooling your brain. Now the thing is, what you need to do to actually be able to do this, because this doesn't necessarily work for everyone. I don't know how, even if it's the majority of people or not, because I've met people who, if you're completely connected to the ego, if you're just 100% identified with the ego and very bothered with the practicalities and dead on realism and reality and the material reality, so it becomes hard, because you wanna because I've met people, as I said, they need to verbalize everything. They cannot just go on through open up in their imagination and say everything they want to in their imagination, and they would feel better. So you better try first with something that you're keeping inside of you. Just close your eyes and go into a somewhat meditative state, in a mindful, just thoughtful state, intentional, and imagine saying something you want to say to someone. Say everything and see if it makes you feel better. And if it does, then it's a very good sign that you could heal your traumas in the same manner. However, some who are very identified with their ego, they find it very hard. They cannot. They just need to practically and realistically accuse someone and blame someone and hurt them and trash them with curses and swears, and in order to feel better. And that's why I mentioned the ego earlier on, because you need to understand the difference between you and the ego, between your true self and the ego, in order to be able to release the trauma in such a manner. You need to understand that you're not your ego, and that you're essentially a higher being who's going through this experience, and to teach the ego something, to teach you and to progress you further into evolvement, into your full potential, into something that you actually deeply want and desire. And so it could be a form of denial to someone who is completely uninterested or unwilling to identify with a higher self. If someone is very absorbed by the ego and only make sense out of this life through the ego, out of themselves, through their ego and nothing else, through just the brain as a mechanical tool, then yes, it might be denial, because then they're fooling themselves. They're not fooling a reality, they're not fooling truth, they're fooling themselves, because they themselves just identify with the ego, and then they're trying to trick the ego. But if you know that you're higher than just an ego, if you know that you have a huge a higher sense of connection than just the ego, then it becomes, it's not denial or fooling. It's that you're just trying to understand the nature of your true self, which is always safe, always connected, always unaffected by the material, unaffected by trauma. And so it's easier to heal. It's easier to heal when you identify with your higher self, when something much bigger than the occurrence. Now, for the bonus techniques, it's something very important, and it's very closely related, and that is to go into a meditative state. When you go into a deep meditation, sit in meditation for a few minutes, for 5 or 10 minutes, depending on how long it takes you to go into a deep state of awareness, a deep state of mindfulness, in which you feel an elevated state of mind. And then recall the whole thing. When you're very deep into meditation, recall the whole thing. As I said, it's not gonna feel as horrible. And then, when you're in that state, try and understand, just understand and forgive. You do not have to say everything, not like the previous technique, but just understand, witness the whole thing and observe it as a higher self. Not as you going through it, but as the higher self that you've achieved through the deep meditative state you went into. And now envision that you're witnessing, and forgive yourself, even if it's yourself that's led you to this traumatic experience. Forgive yourself, forgive everyone included, involved in the experience, and understand that this was done to the best of their ability, to the best of their knowledge at that point, to the best of what they were taught and conditioned to be, and yourself included. Just forgive and understand. Look with an eye of compassion, an eye of understanding. Look deep into what they are and why they were doing this. Try to understand, because they themselves were in, obviously anyone who caused you such a trauma was either in pain themselves, or they were living in survival. They were acting out of fear in order to cause something that would be a traumatizing experience to someone else. They're living out of conditioning. Any of these things, just try to understand the whole scenario and make sense out of it. And so in this manner, it won't be recorded as something that's was not understood and there wasn't a healthy outlet to, but it's rather even not, you don't need a healthy outlet for it anymore, because now you understand it, to the essence of it, to the true nature of it, and you can see it with a different perspective, with a different eye, and it becomes less traumatizing, and not even at all if you do it once and twice. And for the final technique, and this technique also by the psychiatrist, and no, this was different, but this technique, which is yoga, basically yoga mixed with breath work, like breathing while you're doing the yoga and feeling the connection to your body, it's been proven to be more efficient in treating PTSD patients than any other administered medical drug. So it's huge, getting in connection with your body, feeling your body and its connection with earth and with everything around it. you know that you're safe no matter what. You know that you're part of the whole, that you're in a much deeper connection with existence to be than to feel unsafe. And when you do that, it becomes over and over with the intention of connecting with yourself and with feeling every cell of your body and feeling the connection to earth and to the ground and to everyone. It becomes, you feel safe in general, in which that any sort of a traumatizing experience, recalling this experience, wouldn't feel traumatizing anymore. Always remember that this too shall pass, and everything passes, and you are way more than your ego. And with that, I hope you have a great day or a great evening, and I wish to see you again soon. Enjoy, and thank you for tuning in.